The strange behavior Jake's small house was quiet, a bit too quiet for his liking. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the old wooden floors, these were the sounds that filled the empty spaces. Hunter, his loyal German shepherd, had always been a calm and collected dog, a constant companion who'd been with him through thick and thin. But recently, something about Hunter's behavior had been different. It started subtly. At first, Jake thought it was nothing, a random twitch of the tail, a sudden bark at nothing in particular. But over the past few days, the odd behavior escalated. Hunter began scratching the living room wall. At first, Jake assumed it was just a bad habit. Dogs sometimes did strange things, and maybe the wall felt good against Hunter's nails, or perhaps there was a scent that intrigued him. But it didn't stop. Jake watched from his spot on the couch one evening as Hunter began pacing around the living room, his sharp claws clicking against the hardwood floor. The dog moved to the same corner of the room, the corner where the wallpaper had started to peel, where the old paint had faded. Jake noticed that Hunter wasn't just scratching at the wall with the usual light pawing. No, this was frantic, desperate. His claws dug deep into the drywall, as if something behind it was calling to him. "Hunter, what are you doing?" Jake muttered under his breath, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of the dog's strange behavior. It was then that he heard it, a soft whimper. It came from the direction of the wall, so faint at first that Jake wasn't sure if it was his imagination. He leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Another whimper followed, louder this time, a sharp cry of distress that chilled him to his bones. Hunter paused for a moment, his ear twitching, and then resumed his scratching with even more vigor. There was something behind that wall, something alive, something in pain. Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a dog's random habit anymore. This was urgent. His mind raced. Could someone have been trapped behind the wall? He had lived in the house for years, but never noticed anything out of the ordinary about the walls. They were solid, old, maybe a little cracked, but no sign of any kind of hidden space. He stood up abruptly, the couch cushions sinking behind him. His eyes never left Hunter, who was still clawing at the drywall with unrelenting persistence. "Hunter, stop," Jake said softly, stepping toward his dog, placing a hand gently on his back. But Hunter wasn't responding to him. His gaze was fixed on the wall, and his breathing was heavy. It was as though the dog had a sense of urgency, as if he knew time was running out for whoever, or whatever, was trapped behind that wall. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He had to act. Without another thought, he rushed to the closet in the hallway and grabbed the sledgehammer he kept for odd jobs around the house. The handle was familiar in his grip, but the weight of it felt heavy, almost foreboding. He returned to the living room, where Hunter was still scratching the wall, ignoring the man who had once been his sole companion. The dog's actions had only heightened Jake's sense of alarm. The crying behind the wall, muffled and pitiful, was growing louder, more urgent. He had no idea what he might find, but he couldn't let the situation continue. Taking a deep breath, Jake raised the sledgehammer high and brought it down onto the wall with a force that echoed through the house. The drywall cracked, the sound of it splintering like bones under pressure. He swung again and again until the hole was big enough for him to peer inside. What he saw next made his blood run cold. A small, shivering figure huddled in the dark space behind the wall. At first, Jake could barely make out the shape, just a silhouette of what looked like a child, hunched over, her head tucked into her knees. The girl's clothes were ragged, and her skin was pale, almost ghostly, as though she hadn't seen the sun in weeks. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion, but there was a glimmer of recognition in them as she locked eyes with Jake. Hey, it's okay," Jake whispered, kneeling down beside the hole. His voice trembled slightly, but he tried to keep it steady. "You're safe now. I won't hurt you." The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, shrinking back further into the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She didn't speak. She didn't move. It was as though she was frozen, stuck in a moment of terror that wouldn't let go. Jake's heart ached. He could see that she was badly malnourished, her ribs showing beneath her thin shirt, her face hollowed out from what he could only imagine had been days, maybe weeks, of hiding in that suffocating space. He reached his hand through the hole, but she recoiled from his touch, her fear palpable. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jake repeated gently. "You can trust me. I'll get you out of here." Hunter stood beside Jake, his tail wagging cautiously as if he, too, understood the gravity of the situation. The dog gave a soft whine, his eyes focused on the girl, and Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort in the dog's presence, as if Hunter knew exactly what needed to be done next. Jake carefully reached for the girl, his voice soothing as he tried to ease her out of the small space. With trembling hands, she finally took his arm, her fingers cold and weak. He pulled her gently from behind the wall, and as soon as she was in his arms, she buried her face in his chest, sobbing quietly. It was as though the floodgates had opened, and all the pain and fear she'd been holding inside came rushing out. Jake held her tightly, his heart aching for her as Hunter circled around them, his gentle bark echoing softly in the room. The dog nuzzled the girl's hand, offering his silent support. Jake looked down at his faithful companion, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We'll take care of her, Hunter," Jake murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll keep her safe." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jake felt a strange, comforting sense of purpose. He had no idea what had brought the girl here, or who was responsible for hiding her away. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her again. Hunter gave a low growl as if agreeing, and the two of them stood together, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. A horrifying discovery, the seconds felt like hours as Jake held the small, trembling girl in his arms, her body shaking with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Hunter stood by their side, his presence grounding them both. The dog's gentle whine seemed to say that everything would be all right, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the real nightmare was just beginning. He held the girl tighter, feeling the chill in her skin. She was so cold. It was as though she had been living in a shadowed place for far too long, cut off from the warmth of human kindness. He couldn't imagine how she had ended up in that tiny space behind the wall, hidden away like some sort of forgotten secret. And yet, here she was, alive, but barely. Jake's mind raced with questions. Who had put her there? Why? What had she been through? He needed answers, but for now, all he could do was focus on getting her to safety. "I'm going to get you some food," Jake said softly, trying to reassure her. He shifted slightly, lifting the girl off the cold floor and supporting her weight as he began to move toward the kitchen. But as soon as he took a step, the girl tensed in his arms, her face pale with fear. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was barely audible, but the panic in her eyes spoke volumes. She looked around wildly, as though she feared someone might be watching, waiting to come for her. "You can't call the police. You can't tell anyone." Jake stopped in his tracks, his stomach dropping at her words. He could feel her pulse racing beneath his fingers. Her words weren't just a request, they were a warning. "Why?" Jake asked, his voice quiet but firm. He didn't want to frighten her, but he needed to understand. "Who are they? Why are you hiding?" The girl didn't answer right away. Her wide eyes darted to the windows, then to the door, as if she expected someone to burst in at any moment. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Jake placed her gently on the couch and knelt down in front of her. "It's okay. You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." The girl swallowed hard, looking up at him with a mixture of confusion and desperation. "They'll find me," she said barely. More than a whisper. "They always find me." Jake didn't push her further. Instead, he went to the kitchen and began preparing some food. As he worked, his thoughts circled back to what he had found behind the wall. How had she ended up there? The space was small, dark, and barely enough for her to hide in. The drywall had been cracked in a way that suggested it had been hidden for a long time. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal her, to keep her out of sight. Jake had always known his house had its secrets. Old houses often did. But this was something far darker. He had to find out more, but that would have to wait. For now, he needed to focus on Emma and keep her safe. He returned with a simple meal, a bowl of soup and some bread. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and the smell seemed to comfort her. She looked at the food but didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she stared down at her hands, as though trying to convince herself that she wasn't imagining this moment of safety. "Emma," Jake said gently, using the name he'd given her, "you need to eat. You've been through a lot. I promise, no one will hurt you here." Her eyes flickered to him for a brief moment, then back to the food. Slowly, cautiously, she picked up the spoon and began eating. Jake watched her in silence, noticing how thin she was. Her hands shook as she held the spoon, and he realized just how much strength it must have taken her to survive whatever she had been through. As she ate, Jake went over the facts in his head. Emma was clearly terrified of being found. She had said they would find her, which meant there were people looking for her, people who would stop at nothing to get her back. But who were these people? What was their connection to her? He couldn't afford to waste time. He needed to know more, but how could he get Emma to open up without pushing her too far? She was still so fragile, still so broken by whatever had happened to her before she arrived here. As if sensing his thoughts, Emma suddenly looked up, her eyes wide with a strange intensity. "You have to hide me," she said, her voice more urgent now. "They'll come for me. They'll kill me if they find me." Jake was taken aback by her words. The weight of them settled over him like a heavy fog. This wasn't just a runaway girl. This was something much more serious. There was something dangerous behind her fear. "Who are they?" Jake asked again, more gently this time. He took a seat beside her on the couch, his eyes soft but determined. "Who's after you?" Emma shook her head violently, tears spilling from her eyes. She didn't want to answer. Jake could see the emotional strain it took just for her to hold herself together enough to speak. "I can't," she whispered, barely audible. "I can't say. It, it's not safe." Jake felt a surge of frustration, but he tempered it. He couldn't force her to talk, not yet. Instead, he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder in a quiet gesture of reassurance. "Okay," he said softly. "I won't press you, but I will protect you. Whatever it takes. You're not alone." For the first time, Emma met his gaze directly, her eyes filled with something like hope. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. Before Jake could say anything else, the sound of a car engine revving in the distance caught his attention. His heart skipped a beat as he froze, listening intently. The engine was getting closer, the unmistakable hum of a vehicle winding its way down the road. Jake's mind raced. Was it just a coincidence? Or had someone found them already? He stood up quickly, moving toward the window. His heart pounded in his chest as he peered outside, his eyes scanning the quiet street. The car was approaching fast, and it didn't look like it was slowing down. "Get down," Jake whispered urgently to Emma. "Stay quiet." Emma's face went pale, her body freezing in place. She knew what this meant. They were here. They had found her. Jake moved toward the door, his thoughts a blur of urgency. He couldn't let anyone take Emma. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. He reached for his phone and texted Leo, his old detective friend. "They've found us," the message read. What now? As he hit send, the car came to a screeching halt in front of his house. He didn't know who they were. But he knew one thing for sure. The chase had just begun. Gaining trust, the night stretched on, thick with tension. The car had come to a stop in front of Jake's house, and Emma's terrified eyes hadn't left the window since the engine's growl had echoed down the street. Jake stood by the window, his breath shallow as he peered outside. His heart pounded, each beat a warning of the danger that had crept far too close to their door. But whoever had been searching for them, whoever had come so close to finding them, hadn't moved. The silence outside was suffocating. The night air seemed to press against the windows, suffocating, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "Who is it?" Emma whispered from behind him, her voice barely audible. She was still sitting on the couch, her eyes wide with fear, her hands trembling as they gripped the edges of the cushion. Her body had become stiff, defensive, like a wild animal waiting to flee at the slightest sign of danger. Jake hesitated, glancing over his shoulder to see Emma's eyes locked on him, her face a mask of desperation. There was no answer, at least not yet. He couldn't say for sure who was out there. The people chasing Emma could be anyone, some faceless strangers or worse, the men she feared. But for the moment, they were safe. He moved away from the window, making his way back toward the living room where Emma sat. He needed to calm her down, needed to keep her grounded in the present, even if it meant distracting her from the ghosts of her past. "Listen," Jake said gently, his voice soft but firm. "I want to take care of this. You don't need to worry. Just stay quiet and stay here with Hunter." The dog had been silent since the car arrived. He was by the door now, alert, his ears pricked. He watched Jake and Emma, as if waiting for a signal, his every muscle coiled like a spring. Hunter was on edge, but in a way that showed his loyalty to both Jake and the girl he had found. His bond with them had already started to grow, his protective instincts kicking in. Jake could feel it, the unspoken promise between them. Hunter wasn't just Jake's companion anymore. He was part of this strange little family they were building, and he was there to protect them both. But as Jake moved toward the door, he could see Emma's eyes following his every step, her worry growing with each passing second. "I'll stay with Hunter," Emma said quickly, her voice strained. "But you can't." She stopped herself, biting her lip, as though even speaking the words would give power to the fear gripping her chest. She stood up abruptly, swaying on unsteady feet. "You can't go up there. You can't trust anyone. They'll know. They'll know that I'm here." Jake's throat tightened as he looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Her face was pale, her eyes dark with a kind of exhaustion only someone who had been through unimaginable things could know. Her hair, dirty and unkempt, framed her face like a halo of suffering. She wasn't just a scared girl. She was someone who had been through something far worse than anyone should ever have to endure. His resolve hardened. "Emma, I'm not leaving you. But you need to trust me. You're safe here. I won't let anyone take you." He stepped closer to her, his voice low, but filled with a fierce determination. "I know you're scared. I can see it in your eyes. But I'll protect you. You're not alone in this." Her eyes flickered with something, an emotion he couldn't quite place, before she lowered her head, nodding slightly. The fear was still there, but there was something else in her gaze now. The tiniest hint of trust, fragile as glass, but it was there. A single moment of connection between them, and it meant everything. Jake sat beside her, his eyes never leaving hers. He knew they were walking a fine line, one wrong move, one wrong word, and she could close up again. But he couldn't force her. Trust had to be earned. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The only sounds in the room were the soft hum of the refrigerator and the steady, calming rhythm of Hunter's breathing. The dog remained vigilant but stayed close to them, as if sensing the emotional weight in the room. Jake kept his gaze fixed on Emma. He had to show her, through his actions, that he was different, that he wasn't like the people who had hurt her, the ones who had pushed her into hiding. He wasn't going to give up on her, no matter how hard it was. Finally, Emma broke the silence. I don't know who they are," she said, her voice shaky but gaining strength as she spoke. "But I remember voices. In the dark." And her eyes clouded over with something darker, and she trailed off, her hand shaking as she gripped the edge of the couch. Jake didn't push her. He simply nodded, allowing her the space she needed. "You don't have to say anything yet," he reassured her. "Take your time." She didn't speak again for a long while. Instead, she turned to Hunter, her gaze softening for the first time since Jake had found her. The dog sat by her side, his large brown eyes watching her with an almost unnerving intensity, as if he knew how fragile this moment was. And then something unexpected happened. Emma reached out a hand, hesitantly at first, as though unsure whether she should trust the dog or not. Hunter, ever patient, leaned into her touch, his tail wagging gently. She ran her fingers through his fur, a small but meaningful gesture. The softness of his fur seemed to bring her a little comfort, a small piece of peace in the chaos that surrounded them. You're a good dog," Emma whispered, her voice almost inaudible. Jake couldn't help but smile softly. "He's the best," he said, his eyes lingering on Hunter, who was now lying at Emma's feet, watching her with a quiet devotion. Jake had seen many sides of Hunter, but this connection between the dog and Emma was new. It was a bond that had formed quickly, instinctively, and Jake couldn't help but feel grateful. In that moment, as Emma sat there with Hunter, Jake realized that the small, seemingly insignificant actions were the ones that would help them all survive. Trust wasn't going to come all at once. But every moment like this, every shared silence, every small gesture of connection, was a step forward. As the night wore on, and the danger outside seemed to fade into the distance, Jake knew they weren't out of the woods yet. But for the first time since Emma had come into his life, he felt a flicker of hope. A hope that, with time, they could all heal. And that hope, fragile as it was, would be enough to get them through whatever came next. The man in the dark jacket the following morning, the world outside felt strangely still. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the living room. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, almost normal. But Jake knew better. Normal was a thing of the past. The storm was still out there, just waiting to make its presence known. Emma, now curled up on the couch, was sleeping soundly, her face free of the constant terror that had marked her waking hours the day before. Her chest rose and fell slowly, a subtle reminder that she was still fragile, still recovering from whatever nightmare had led her here. Hunter lay at her feet, his ears perked up at the smallest sound, his alertness a reminder of the constant danger lurking just outside their door. Jake stood at the window, watching the street in front of his house. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, with little activity at this time of morning. The occasional car passed by, the usual joggers making their rounds. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And then he saw him. Across the street, near the corner of a small coffee shop, stood a man. At first, Jake thought it was just a passerby, someone minding their own business. But something about the man's stillness made Jake uneasy. The man was tall, his features hard to make out under the shadows of his dark jacket, but his posture was rigid, calculating. His eyes seemed to be scanning the area, darting between the houses, moving in quick, precise motions. There was no mistaking it. This man wasn't just walking. He was looking for something, or someone. Jake's gut tightened. He couldn't be sure, but everything about the man screamed danger. His unkempt appearance, his deliberate movements, it all felt wrong. Jake knew that look. He'd seen it before, in his old life as a cop. The kind of person who was always watching, always waiting. Someone who didn't belong here, who wasn't just passing through. And then it hit Jake, he was looking for them. The man knew they were here. He had found them. Jake's breath quickened, and for a moment, the world outside the window blurred. His mind raced as he weighed his options. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Emma was still sleeping, unaware of the threat outside. But Jake had. No doubt that if he moved too quickly, if he made one wrong move, that man would spot him. He turned toward the back of the house, his mind snapping into action. He needed to get Emma and Hunter somewhere safe, somewhere that the man couldn't find them. The cabin was an option, but it was too far, too exposed. The garage might give them a few minutes to hide, but Jake knew they couldn't stay there for long. He grabbed his phone, fingers trembling as he typed a message to Leo. "We've got company. I need help. Fast." Leo's response was immediate. "Stay hidden. Do not engage. I'm on my way." Jake shoved the phone back into his pocket, glancing one last time at the man across the street. The figure hadn't moved. It was almost as if he was waiting for something, or perhaps someone. Jake couldn't afford to sit around and wonder. He moved quickly through the house, waking Emma with gentle but firm hands. She startled at his touch, her eyes wide with fear, but when she saw the expression on his face, she went still. She didn't need to ask. She could see it in his eyes. There was no time for questions. "Emma," Jake whispered, his voice low and steady. "We need to go. Now." She nodded, her face pale, but she didn't hesitate. Emma gathered her things, her hands shaking, her eyes darting toward the door. Hunter was already by the door, tail tucked between his legs, sensing the shift in the air. The dog was ready to move, his instinctual need to protect kicking in. Jake opened the back door, motioning for Emma to follow. He stepped outside, scanning the street for any sign of movement. The man in the dark jacket was still standing there watching. But now his eyes were fixed on the house, on Jake. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he moved toward the garage, every step measured and calculated. The distance between him and the man across the street seemed to stretch longer with each passing second, the threat growing more real with every inch. They weren't safe here. Not anymore. They reached the garage, and Jake quickly closed the door behind him, locking it with a soft click. He moved to the back of the house, where a narrow path led to the side gate. The alley was their only way out, but it was cramped, and it would take them through a row of houses. It wasn't ideal, but it was all they had. "Stay close to me," Jake instructed Emma, his voice low and commanding. "Do not make a sound." They stepped into the alley, the narrow space offering little cover. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and grass, and the sound of their footsteps echoed louder than Jake liked. He kept his hand on Emma's shoulder, guiding her through the shadows. Hunter was right behind them, his senses alert, his body tense. The dog was ready to spring into action if needed. As they turned the corner, Jake's eyes caught a movement up ahead, another man, this one wearing a baseball cap and standing next to a parked car. He was looking straight at them. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "They're everywhere," he muttered under his breath. His mind raced. They were being boxed in. Every exit was closing. He had to make a decision fast. "Emma," Jake whispered, his voice urgent, "we need to go through the back streets. Stay low. Keep quiet." The man in the baseball cap was still staring, and Jake knew they didn't have much time. They turned sharply, slipping into another alleyway, the sounds of the city muffled by the urgency in their movements. Jake's mind was spinning. He needed to get them out of this. He needed to keep Emma safe. But the worst part? He knew that they weren't going to stop looking. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The breaking point, the alleyway was quiet, save for the muffled sounds of their hurried footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. Jake led Emma down a narrow path, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with the urgency of their situation. The man in the dark jacket, the one who had been watching them from across the street, was still lingering in the area. Jake could feel his presence like a shadow stalking them from behind. It was too quiet. The distant hum of city traffic seemed so far away now, replaced by the oppressive silence of their escape. Every step felt like it could be their last, every turn a potential dead end. Hunter was alert, his tail tucked low, and his eyes scanning every corner, every crack in the pavement. The dog was more than just a companion now. He was a lifeline, a protector. But Jake knew that even Hunter couldn't keep them safe forever if the men after them kept closing in. They rounded the corner into another street, and Jake's instinct screamed at him to keep moving. He could sense the danger tightening around them. They were being watched. He had no doubt that the man in the dark jacket wasn't the only one on their tail. As they walked, Jake kept checking over his shoulder, trying to make sense of the movement in the distance. But there was nothing there, not yet. Just shadows and the faint hum of the wind. "Jake." Emma's voice was quiet but filled with a raw fear that sent a chill down his spine. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Jake slowed his pace, looking at her. Emma's face was pale, her eyes hollow from the weight of the fear that had been hanging over her for so long. The adrenaline had kept her going until now, but it was clear that she was reaching her breaking point. The constant anxiety, the panic that she was never truly safe, it was too much for her to handle alone. He knelt down in front of her, his hands gently cupping her face. "Emma, listen to me," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You hear me? We're getting out of this. You and me will make it through." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face as if looking for any sign of reassurance. There was something fragile about her now, something raw. But the trust that had started to form between them over the last few days was still there. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to get them through this moment. "I believe you," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "But what if they find us? What if they—" Before she could finish, Jake's gaze snapped to the left. A shadow moved just ahead, shifting against the backdrop of a nearby building. A figure was approaching, moving swiftly, purposefully. Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was the man in the dark jacket. He was getting closer. Jake grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her into the nearest doorway, out of sight. The door was a small, weathered cafe, its windows cracked and covered with grime. It was empty, abandoned, and would give them a brief moment to hide. Jake pressed his back against the door, keeping Emma as still as possible beside him, her breath shallow as she fought to stay quiet. The sound of footsteps grew louder and then stopped just outside the door. Jake held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. The man was right there. He could hear the rustle of clothing, the slight creak of a boot on the sidewalk. He could almost feel the man's presence, the way he was searching, methodical, and patient. Jake could sense that this was the moment. If they didn't act fast, they'd be caught. He risked a quick glance through the crack in the window, his eyes scanning the street. The man was standing at the corner now, peering down the alley where they had just been. His posture was stiff, his eyes sharp, as if he were waiting for something, waiting for them to make a mistake. Jake's pulse quickened. He had to act. The man was too close. In a flash, Jake grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her further into the shadowed recesses of the cafe. He crouched low, motioning for Hunter to follow. The dog, ever alert, obeyed without hesitation, his body tense as he followed them into the dark interior. "Stay here," Jake whispered, his eyes meeting Emma's one last time. "Don't make a sound. I'll go check it out." Emma's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded silently. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too. A quiet strength, something that made him believe they could make it through this. As Jake stepped cautiously toward the back exit of the cafe, his eyes never leaving the window, he heard a faint click. A soft sound, barely noticeable, but it made his blood run cold. The man had seen them. Before Jake could react, the door to the cafe burst open, slamming against the wall with a violent crash. Jake spun around, his instincts kicking in as he raised his arm to shield Emma. But it was too late. The man in the dark jacket was already inside, his gaze cold and calculating as he stepped over the threshold. Looking for something, the man's voice was low, a sinister calm in his tone. Jake's hand instinctively reached for the gun at his side, but before he could draw it, the man held up his hands, as if to show he wasn't here to fight. But the look in his eyes, Jake knew better than to trust that. "You're a little too deep in this," the man continued, his voice chilling. "And now you've got to deal with the consequences." Jake's mind raced. He couldn't let the man take Emma. He couldn't let this be the end. There was no time for hesitation now. "Stay behind me," Jake muttered to Emma, his grip on her arm tightening as he shifted to put himself between her and the man. He needed a way out. Hunter growled from behind him, his fur bristling with protective instinct. The man glanced at the dog but didn't seem fazed. His eyes never left Jake, sizing him up, calculating. "Make this easy," the man said, his voice hardening. "Give her to me. It's over." The tension in the room was unbearable. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts darting between survival and strategy. The man was too close. Emma's life was on the line, and the only thing Jake could think of was one word: escape. The chase begins. Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him as he stood between Emma and the man in the dark jacket. His heart was pounding in his chest, the rush of adrenaline making every second stretch longer than it should. There was no way out of this, no way to avoid what was coming. The man had closed the distance, and they were trapped. The walls were closing in on them. The world outside felt unreachable, and the room felt smaller with every breath Jake took. The man's cold eyes never wavered. He was confident, too confident, as if this moment was nothing more than another routine operation. But Jake wasn't like the others. This wasn't just some mission to him. This was personal. "Move aside," the man said in a low voice, his words sharp like a knife. "You're in my way." "I'm not asking again." Jake stood his ground, keeping his body between the man and Emma. His grip tightened around his gun, the metal cold against his palm. He wasn't afraid to fight, but he knew they couldn't stay here for long. Emma needed to be somewhere safe, far away from this man and whatever he represented. Hunter, sensing the tension, growled softly behind him, his body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. The dog had never been more alert, his instincts sharper than ever before. The bond between Hunter and Jake had deepened over the past few days, and it was clear now Hunter wasn't just a dog. He was family, and family didn't let each other down. The man stepped closer, his posture relaxed, as though he didn't even view Jake as a threat. He wasn't foolish, though. He knew what Jake was capable of, but his confidence was born from a different kind of experience. The kind of experience that came from chasing people, cornering them, taking them when they least expected it. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't allow the man to get any closer, couldn't let Emma fall into his hands. Not now, not when they were so close to escaping. The man might have the upper hand now, but that wouldn't last long. Before Jake could make a move, the man spoke again, his voice filled with an unsettling calmness. "You can't protect her. She's already in my reach. You don't know who you're up against." Jake's jaw clenched as his hand moved toward his gun. He wasn't going to let this man win. Not now. Not ever. But just as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, the man's eyes shifted. His gaze flitted past Jake, scanning the room, analyzing every possible exit. His attention wasn't on Jake anymore. A chill ran down Jake's spine. The man was thinking beyond this moment, beyond just taking them here. He was waiting for something. He was anticipating the next move. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed Emma's arm and yanked her behind him, pushing her toward the narrow hallway that led to the back of the building. "Go," he barked at her, his voice low but filled with urgency. But as they moved, the man's voice followed them, cool and taunting. "Run, then. You'll never make it far enough." Jake ignored him, focusing on Emma's safety. They had to get out of there. He pushed Emma ahead of him, his hand firm on her shoulder as they slipped into the alley behind a cafe. The cool air was thick with the tension that hung in the narrow space, the weight of their escape pressing down on Jake's chest. Hunter was at their heels, always watching, always protecting. The dog's low growls were a constant reminder that they weren't alone. Jake's thoughts were a blur, but there was one thing he knew for sure. They needed to put distance between themselves and that man. They couldn't let him get any closer. They rounded the corner and continued down the alley, their footsteps loud in the stillness of the city. Every sound felt amplified. Every echo of their movement felt like a warning, an alarm that someone would hear them and catch up. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, his instinct screaming at him. He could almost hear the man's voice in his head. "You'll never outrun me." And Jake knew he was right. They wouldn't outrun him, but they could outsmart him. They could survive this. As they reached a quiet street, Jake's eyes locked onto a parked van. It was old, its paint chipped and faded, but it offered one thing: cover. They could hide there, regroup, and plan their next move. "Get in the van," Jake ordered Emma. "No." She hesitated for a split second, but when she saw the look in his eyes, she didn't argue. Without a word, she scrambled into the back of the van, and Jake followed close behind, slamming the door shut just as a car engine roared to life in the distance. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The man had heard them. He was coming. Jake could feel it in his bones. There was no time to waste. They couldn't stay here, not with a man so close. "Drive," Jake muttered to Emma, his voice low and urgent. "We need to keep moving. Don't stop for anything." Emma's hand shook as she gripped the wheel, her knuckles white from the strain. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty. She wasn't used to running. She wasn't used to living like this. But she was with him now, and that meant they had a chance. As the van lurched forward, Jake looked out the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of the man in the dark jacket. The chase was on. They had a head start, but they couldn't let their guard down. Not now. Not ever. Hunter's ears pricked up as the sound of the van's engine rumbled, and Jake could feel the tension building in there. They weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. But they were moving. They were still in this fight. The road ahead was uncertain, and every corner that they turned felt like a risk. But Jake knew one thing. As long as they had each other, Emma, Hunter, and him, they could survive this. The chase had begun. And this time, it was personal. Hiding in plain sight, the van sped through the narrow streets, the engine roaring beneath them as the city passed in a blur of motion. Jake's mind was spinning, calculating every possible escape route, every option to keep Emma and Hunter safe. The tension in the van was thick, almost suffocating. Emma sat beside him, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face was pale, her breath shallow, and Jake could see the fatigue in her eyes. The terror had drained her, but the drive to survive, the will to escape, was still there. "Keep going," Jake urged, his voice a firm but gentle command. "Just stay focused, Emma. We're not out of it yet." She nodded without a word, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She was doing her best to keep it together, but Jake could see the cracks in her composure. The fear still lurked just beneath the surface, threatening to break through. But they couldn't afford to dwell on that now. They had to keep moving, keep running, until they were far away from the people hunting them. Hunter lay at their feet, his body still as a statue. The dog had been unusually quiet since the chase had started, his ears perked up, constantly alert. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was their guardian, their protector, and Jake had come to rely on him in ways he couldn't have imagined just days ago. They didn't have a clear destination in mind. They just needed to get far enough away, out of sight long enough to regroup and figure out their next move. As the van took another sharp turn, Jake's mind began to search for a safe place, a haven, somewhere that could offer them a moment of respite. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A small, run-down motel at the edge of the city, its neon sign flickering like a dying star. It wasn't much, but was hidden, tucked away behind overgrown bushes and trees. It was the perfect place to lay low for a while, to stop, breathe, and think. "Pull into the motel," Jake instructed Emma, his voice low and urgent. He glanced out the rearview mirror, scanning the streets behind them. It was still too early to relax. The man in the dark jacket, the one chasing them, was relentless. Jake had no doubt that they weren't out of danger yet. The motel would only give them a temporary respite, but it was better than nothing. Emma didn't argue. She veered the van into the motel's parking lot, her eyes constantly darting to the side mirrors, her grip on the wheel tightening with each passing second. They came to a slow stop in front of one of the rooms, its number barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint. Jake didn't wait for Emma to park the van completely. He was already out the door, scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Hunter followed closely, his every movement calculated, his ears swiveling as if sensing something lurking in the air. Emma quickly exited the van, still looking over her shoulder as she slammed the door shut behind her. She moved fast, but there was a distinct weariness in her steps. "Stay close," Jake ordered, his tone sharp. "We're not staying long." The motel was deserted, the rooms dark and unkempt. It seemed as though the place hadn't seen a guest in years, and yet that was exactly what made it the perfect hiding place. Jake pushed open the door to their assigned room and stepped inside. The stale air hit him immediately, musty and damp, the remnants of a place long abandoned. The fluorescent light buzzed above them, casting an eerie glow across the room. Emma hesitated at the threshold, her eyes wide as she took in their surroundings. It wasn't a luxurious haven, but it was shelter for now. "I'll take the first watch," Jake said, his voice steady. "You and Hunter get some rest. You need it." Emma nodded, though Jake could see that the exhaustion was taking its toll on her. She had barely slept since the night before, and it was clear that her nerves were frayed. But the weight of what they were running from, the people who had taken her, the man in the dark jacket who wouldn't stop hunting her, was more than enough to keep her awake. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "I mean, don't you need sleep too?" Jake shook his head. "I'll sleep when I know you're safe." He motioned toward the small bed in the corner. "Just try to get some rest. I'll keep watch. If anyone comes, we'll be ready." Emma didn't argue. She sat down on the bed, the exhaustion catching up with her as she stretched out, curling into herself like a small, fragile thing trying to escape the weight of the world. Jake moved to the window, carefully parting the curtains to get a better view of the parking lot. He could see the entrance to the motel, the faint outline of cars passing by in the distance. But there was no sign of anyone suspicious, no sign of the man in the dark jacket, no indication that they had been followed. But Jake knew that could change in an instant. He couldn't afford to relax. Not yet. Hunter sat beside him, his body still, his head raised, as though listening for any noise. Jake reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, the familiar warmth of the gesture offering a brief moment of comfort. "You're doing great, boy," Jake muttered under his breath, his hand continuing its steady motion. "We'll keep her safe. We won't let them get to her." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, a silent confirmation of his unwavering loyalty. Jake's eyes flicked toward Emma, now lying on the bed, her breathing slowing as she finally began to drift off to sleep. The room was silent, save for the occasional hum of the overhead light and the soft shuffle of Hunter's paws. Jake was grateful for the moment of peace, however fleeting it might be. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't last long. They were being hunted, and no matter how far they ran, the man in the dark jacket, whoever he was, would find them. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a game of survival, and Jake wasn't going to let anyone take Emma. Not without a fight. The motel room felt like a temporary sanctuary, but Jake knew they couldn't stay long. He was already planning their next move, mapping out their route, thinking ahead to the next hiding place. And as he stood there, his back to the window, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. They were in the eye of the storm. A warning from Henry, the night had fallen quietly over the motel, but Jake knew better than to trust the silence. The low hum of the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, and the heavy scent of must and stale air clung to everything around them. Emma was asleep on the bed, her body curled tightly under the thin blanket, while Hunter lay at the foot of the bed, his eyes constantly scanning the room as if waiting for danger to break through. Jake sat by the window, his back pressed against the peeling wallpaper, his eyes never straying too far from the parking lot outside. He could still feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the rush of the chase, the narrow escape from the man in the dark jacket. His mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. What did these people want with Emma? Why was she so important to them? These were questions that had been gnawing at him ever since he'd found her hiding in the wall. But there was no time for answers, not now. As he stared into the darkness outside, a faint sound broke the stillness. The faint buzz of his phone. He pulled it from his pocket quickly, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Leo. Stay hidden. I'm working on something. Don't trust anyone right now. Jake's fingers tightened around the phone. The words felt like a warning, more than a simple message. He wasn't sure what Leo was working on, but Jake knew he couldn't rely on anyone right now. They were on their own, and they had to stay that way if they were going to make it out of this. But then came another message, this time from an unknown number. Get out of the motel. Now. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. That warning. It was Henry. He had met Henry only once before, a few years ago when things were simpler, when he was still a cop. Henry had been one of those people on the fringe, always there, always watching, but never fully involved. He was someone who had a knack for knowing things, for understanding the underworld that most people didn't even know existed. Henry had contacts, connections that ran deep, and Jake had always been able to rely on him when things went south. But now things had changed. Henry was the one telling them to leave. The man who always stayed in the shadows, who never showed his cards, had just given them a warning. And Jake knew from experience that when Henry said something like that, it wasn't just a suggestion. Emma, Jake whispered, his voice low, enough to stir her from her sleep. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed, as she tried to make sense of the urgency in his tone. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, her body stiff from the night's rest. Get up, Jake ordered, moving swiftly to the door. We need to go. Now. Emma blinked, confused, her voice shaky. Jake, what's happening? What's wrong? Jake's eyes locked onto hers, his expression grave. We're not safe here. Someone's coming for us. We have to move before they find us. Without waiting for a response, Jake grabbed her arm gently but firmly, guiding her toward the back exit of the motel. Hunter, sensing the shift in energy, was already at their heels, his body tense, ready for whatever was coming next. Stay close to me, Jake said, his voice low, but filled with authority. Emma nodded, her face pale, but she didn't argue. She had learned to trust him, to follow his lead even when everything felt out of control. They moved quickly through the back of the motel, making sure not to make a sound. The old wooden floor creaked underfoot as they carefully slipped out of the room and into the alleyway that ran behind the motel. The air was cooler now, the smell of rain in the distance mixing with the stale, industrial scent of the city. Jake led them through the narrow alley, keeping to the shadows. He was listening for any sign of movement, his senses heightened, every part of his body alert. He could hear the distant hum of cars, but there was something more, an underlying sense of being watched, hunted. Why are we leaving? Emma asked in a hushed voice, her breath quickening with attention. I don't understand. Why does he want us to leave? Jake glanced at her, his expression hard. I don't know. But I trust Henry. If he says we're in danger, we move. No questions. They turned a corner and came to a stop near an abandoned diner. Its windows were dark, the sign broken, but the building offered some cover. Jake checked the street again. There was no sign of pursuit, but he wasn't taking any chances. Emma's breath was shaky, and Jake could see her eyes darting around, her anxiety mounting with each passing second. What if they find you, Jake? She whispered, her voice full of fear. We won't let them, Jake said, his voice firm, filled with a calm that he didn't feel. He needed to reassure her, to show her that there was still hope. We'll make it through. We'll find a way out of this. He reached for his phone again, his fingers scrolling through the messages from Henry. The most recent one was a cryptic message that sent a chill down his spine. You've been compromised. The people after you have eyes everywhere. You need to get off the grid. Jake's jaw clenched. They were deeper into this than he had realized. The people after Emma weren't just local criminals. They were connected, organized, and they had resources. Henry's warning confirmed what Jake had already suspected. They weren't just running from some random thug. They were running from a well-funded, highly coordinated operation. Jake's mind worked quickly. Emma, we need to move. Now. The alley stretched before them, empty for now, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way. The danger was closing in, and they had no time to waste. Henry's warning was a reminder that their time was running out. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that they would be found. They needed to get off the grid, but how? Just then, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine approaching. His heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had to make a decision fast. Stay close to me, Jake said again, his grip tightening around Emma's arm. We need to keep moving. A desperate escape plan, the car engine roared, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle getting closer. Jake's senses snapped into overdrive. They were running out of time. The narrow alleyway they had just entered suddenly felt like a trap, the walls closing in on them with every second. He quickly scanned the surroundings, his mind racing through possible escape routes. They couldn't stay here. There was no way to outrun whoever was coming if they remained in the open. Come on, Jake whispered urgently to Emma, his voice low but sharp. We have to go. Now. Her face was still pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed Hunter's leash, pulling the dog closer as she followed Jake, her footsteps quick but quiet against the wet concrete. Every movement had to be careful, controlled. The last thing they needed was to make noise and draw attention. The sound of the engine was growing louder. Whoever was in that car wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. Jake's mind was already calculating their next move. The diner was just ahead, its old neon sign flickering weakly in the night. It was their best bet, a place to hide in. Plain sight, a way to get out of the immediate danger zone. As they neared the diner, Jake motioned for Emma to stay low, to stay in the shadows. He wasn't sure how much time they had before the car turned the corner and spotted them, but they had to make it inside. They moved as one, slipping into the building through the back door. The door creaked as it opened, but it was quick enough that the sound didn't reach the street. Inside, the air was stale, and the broken light fixtures overhead only added to the sense of abandonment. The diner hadn't seen customers in years, but it was perfect for their needs. It offered shelter from the world outside, at least for a little while. Jake closed the door behind him, his heart racing as he leaned against the wall. He glanced at Emma, who was breathing heavily, her eyes darting toward the windows. She was still shaking, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. We're not safe yet, Jake muttered, more to himself than to Emma. He couldn't afford to relax, not until they were miles away from this place. Emma, still clutching Hunter's leash, looked at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. Jake, what's happening? Why are they after me? What's going on? Jake met her gaze, his own face taut with concern. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the need for answers, but he wasn't sure he had them. He didn't know who was behind this, who was pulling the strings, or what exactly they wanted with her. But the one thing he knew for certain was that they weren't safe. Someone's after you, Jake said, his voice low and steady. I don't know who or why, but they won't stop until they find you. Emma's breath caught in her throat. But why me? I don't even know who they are. I don't remember. Her voice broke, and Jake could see the guilt in her eyes. He could see the way she blamed herself for everything that had happened to her. The trauma, the fear, it was all weighing on her. It wasn't something she could easily shake off. You're not to blame for any of this, Jake said firmly, stepping closer to her. You're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I'll make sure they never get you. Emma looked up at him, her expression softening just for a moment. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But the fear was still there, lingering in her eyes, waiting for the next moment of danger to rear its ugly head. Jake let out a breath and pulled out his phone, quickly texting Leo. We need to move. The people chasing us are organized. We need a new plan. The reply came almost immediately. Get off the grid. I'm working on something. Don't trust anyone. Get to the safe house. Now. Jake's stomach tightened. The safe house? It was a last resort, a place where they could disappear, where the people after them wouldn't be able to find them. It sounded like the right choice, but Jake knew the journey wouldn't be easy. It was a long way from here, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't be intercepted along the way. Emma, Jake said, his voice urgent, we've got to move. They're the safe house. It's our only shot at getting out of this. She nodded, her fear momentarily replaced by a flicker of determination. Okay, let's go, Jake. Motioned for her to stay close. The plan was simple. Get to the safe house as quickly as possible, without drawing attention. They couldn't afford to be noticed. Every step, every turn had to be calculated. They would have to move through the city like shadows, blending in, staying out of sight. The closer they got, the safer they would be. As they left the diner, Jake kept his eyes on the streets. There was no sign of the car, no sign of the people who had been following them. But Jake didn't trust the silence. He knew it wouldn't last. They moved quickly, slipping through alleyways and side streets, always aware of their surroundings. The further they got, the more distant the danger seemed, but Jake knew better than to relax. The safe house was miles away, and anything could happen along the way. The city streets stretched before them, dark and empty, as the weight of their flight pressed down on them. Every corner they turned felt like a new risk. Every step felt like a countdown. "We need to keep moving," Jake said, his voice low. "The moment we stop, we're sitting ducks." Emma nodded, her grip on Hunter's leash tightening as they continued down the street. She didn't speak, but Jake could feel the strain in her every movement, the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. She had been through more than anyone should have to endure, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But Jake wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting, and they were going to make it to that safe house, no matter what. The final decision, the streets blurred around them as they moved deeper into the city's shadows. Jake's mind was focused, every step calculated, every move deliberate. Emma was still by his side, her body tense but determined, her eyes scanning the darkened streets ahead. Hunter trotted silently beside them, his keen instincts alert to every shift in the air. They had been running for what felt like hours, ducking into alleys, cutting through side streets, avoiding the main roads where they might be seen. They couldn't afford to be noticed. They couldn't afford to stop. The safe house was their only chance, and it was still miles away. But the city felt like a maze, a labyrinth of shadows that could swallow them whole. As they neared a quiet park, Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, glancing at the screen. The message was from Leo. "They're close. Be ready. Don't trust anyone who offers help." Jake's stomach dropped. He had known that they couldn't trust anyone, but hearing it from Leo made the danger feel more real, more immediate. The people after Emma were closer than he'd realized, and the safe house wasn't as safe as he'd hoped. Whoever was chasing them had eyes everywhere. They were being hunted. "Emma," Jake said, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to keep moving. There's no time to waste." Emma nodded, but Jake could see the weariness in her eyes. The fear, the exhaustion. It was all catching up to her. She had been through more in the past few days than most people could endure in a lifetime, and yet she was still standing, still fighting. Jake's respect for her grew with each passing moment. Hunter, too, seemed to sense the shift. The dog's movements had slowed, and his head was held lower, as if he knew the gravity of their situation. Jake could feel the weight of it, too. The danger was closing in, and the safe house wasn't the end of their journey. It was just another step. They reached a small, run-down gas station, tucked away on the outskirts of the city. The faded neon lights buzzed above them, casting a sickly green glow over the area. The place looked abandoned, but that was exactly why it could be useful. No one would expect to find them here. Jake held up a hand, signaling Emma to stop. "Stay low. Stay quiet. We can't risk being seen." They moved through the station's empty lot, heading toward a small back entrance. Jake checked the area again, making sure there was no sign of pursuit. There was nothing. For now, they were safe. But Jake's instincts told him it wouldn't last long. He felt it deep in his gut, the feeling of being watched. He couldn't shake it. "Stay here," Jake said, glancing at Emma. "I'll check inside. Stay close to Hunter. Don't move unless I say so." Emma looked at him, her expression a mix of apprehension and exhaustion. "What are we going to do, Jake? How much longer can we keep running?" Jake didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up. But he wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now, not when they were this close. He stepped toward the door, pushing it open slowly. The hinges creaked, and the sound made his muscles tense. Inside, the gas station was as empty as the lot outside. The shelves were barren, and the counter was covered in dust. But there was something odd about the place. It felt too quiet, too empty. Jake's hand instinctively went to his sidearm as he moved deeper into the station, every sense on high alert. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up, but there was no sign of danger. No one was here, or so it seemed. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "You really thought you could hide here?" Jake froze, his hand tightening around the gun. his heart skipping a beat. The voice was cold, menacing. He knew that voice. He'd heard it before. It was the man in the dark jacket. Jake's pulse quickened. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows. And then he saw him, standing in the doorway, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. "You've been a pain in my side for too long," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. "But you've finally led me right where I need you." Jake's mind raced. There was no time to think. He had to act. He had to protect Emma, protect them both. He reached for his phone in his pocket, his fingers trembling. He had one shot at this. One chance to make the right call. "Leo?" Jake whispered, his voice tight. "No. I need backup. Now." Before Leo could respond, the man in the dark jacket moved, stepping into the room with quick, calculated strides. His eyes locked onto Jake, and the air seemed to thicken, like the calm before a storm. "You should have stayed out of this," the man said, his lips curling into a sneer. "But now it's too late." Jake knew he couldn't take this fight on alone. He had to buy Emma time. He had to buy himself time. Without thinking, Jake took a step back, his eyes darting to the door, to Emma, still outside, still vulnerable. If he could just keep the man occupied long enough. And then the unexpected happened. Hunter, ever the protector, lunged forward with a growl that echoed through the station, his teeth bared, his eyes filled with a protective fury that Jake had never seen before. The dog moved faster than the man expected, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing into the counter. Jake didn't wait. He sprinted toward the door, his heart in his throat. Emma was standing there, her eyes wide with panic, but when she saw him, her expression shifted, relief, fear, and hope, all mixed together. "We need to go now," Jake shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the exit. Behind them, they could hear the man in the dark jacket scrambling to get back on his feet, cursing under his breath. But it didn't matter. They had one chance to escape, and Jake wasn't going to let it slip away. They burst out of the gas station into the night, where the distant sound of sirens could be heard faintly in the background. Jake didn't know where they would go next, but he knew they had to keep moving, keep running, until they were far away from this nightmare. And as they disappeared into the darkness, Jake made a silent promise. No one would take Emma. Not while he was still breathing.